we'll make a start in the interest of time. So I'm Fran Heathcote, General Secretary of the PCS Union, really proud to be chairing this session today, and obviously a really important session for us entitled Trump, Starmer and the Next Steps of the Movement. And just by way of opening remarks, I just want to make a few points before I introduce our first speaker. Obviously, Donald Trump has claimed that he wants war, to end wars, and some of his supporters have said that he'll be an anti-war president. And I'm sure nobody in this room falls for that claptrap, but it is worth pointing out that the last time he was president, in Afghanistan, he substantially increased the number of airstrikes, which led to a 330% increase in civilian deaths. In Yemen, he increased US involvement and boosted military support for the devastating Saudi-led war, which led to thousands of deaths and famine in parts of the country. In his newly appointed cabinet, there are numerous people with links to arms manufacturers and who have made warmongering statements in recent months and years. And his new choice for the ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, has said there is no such thing as the Palestinian people. He said that there is no He said that there is no West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria, and that there are no settlements, just villages, towns and cities. Trump has been very clear he will back every genocidal action of the Netanyahu government, and his support for Vladimir Putin in the Ukraine shows he is consistently backing illegal military occupations and imperial conquest. And so finally, I want to bring it back to the UK. We have to remember the dangers of a far-right Republican and Labour Party Prime Minister. The last time we had that combination, it gave us the Afghanistan war and the war on Iraq. So our efforts have to focus on detaching the UK from the coattails of US foreign policy, especially as that moves the world into a potentially even more dangerous place. And with that, I want to introduce our first speaker, who probably needs absolutely no introduction. She's the convener of Stop the War. It's Lindsey German. So
thank you very much for coming and for chairing this session, because one of the most important things we want to do is strengthen our relationship with the trade unions. I know PCS has always been a huge supporter of our campaigns. I wanted to start by just recounting a programme I listened to on the BBC the other day. It was a news programme, and the first item was a long and very sympathetic discussion about why people go on demonstrations. And why sometimes they take direct action and have to do all these sorts of things. And I thought, if only we could have this about Palestine. But this was, of course, about the farmers who are protesting about the inheritance tax and various other things. They get lots of time to explain why, if necessary, they're going to block roads or withhold food from people. We can guess probably they won't get the same treatment as the Just Stop Oil protesters or anybody else who's been arrested over the past year for direct action. But what was also very interesting was the next session was they asked a man who lived in London but whose family are in Gaza how he contacted his family and what he felt about it and what they felt about it. So they asked a number of questions about, how terrible is it for people? Yes, it's absolutely terrible, all these sorts of different questions. And they asked him, what is it you say to your family in Gaza from here in London? And he said, I tell them about these demonstrations that take place all the time in London. I tell them about the demonstrations that take place around the country. I tell them that the British people are not with Israel, they're with the Palestinians. And I felt, and this went on and on, he kept doing it until, of course, they moved him on to another subject, why they were talking about something else. And I just felt immensely proud that our demonstrations, whatever else we have done, there are people in Gaza who know that they're happening, who know that we do stand with Palestinians, and who know that around the world there are people acting in solidarity with them. And I think if we did nothing else, if we hadn't achieved anything else, and other speakers have talked today a lot about what we've achieved and are still trying to achieve, I think that would be a real credit to our movement and a real credit to what we've done over the past year and a bit, and a very, very important thing for us. So when we look at Trump and what bring to the whole story now, and they're both, you know, Trump's going to take office in January, Fran's outlined very well what Trump stands for. We shouldn't fall for the idea that although he did, I think, harness quite a strong anti-war opinion in the United States against militarism, against war, and against the money that is sent to Ukraine when people in the United States, working class people, are suffering just as they are here. But we know that Trump will act in the interests of US imperialism. He's not going to do whatever the difference is between him and Biden. We've already had the genocide in Gaza, which Biden has been absolutely central to sustaining. We've already had the huge amount of weapons that have gone year after year to Ukraine. The idea that Trump, who wants to end the war in Ukraine, but so, to be honest, if Harris had got elected, she probably would have had to end the war in Ukraine as well. We know that whatever the tactical differences, they are both committed to militarism, to war, and to continuing these wars around the world, not just in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and in the Pacific. So all of those things are very, I think we have to understand when we look at Trump, this is about the interests of American imperialism and how they deal with their supposed enemies, and it's not about the idea that somehow all these wars are going to end. And Trump will make these kind of bravado statements because he thinks he's a complete megalomaniac apart from anything else. But when it comes down to it, he will act in quite a similar way. When we come to what will Starmer do, well, we've seen Starmer since July, and we've seen him before that, and only last week in Parliament, when he was asked by one of the independent MPs, will you condemn the genocide in Gaza, he said, I don't know how you can ask this question without referring to what happened on October the 7th. And then he said that I don't recognise this as a genocide, and you have to understand what the definition of genocide is. Now, the truth is that anybody who looks at what is happening in Gaza, anybody who looks at it objectively, has to see this as ethnic cleansing, as war crimes, and as a genocidal attack, which, if anything, is getting worse in the north of Gaza, with people being starved, with people being driven out of their homes. And we're also seeing that in the West Bank, where there's increasing attacks on the Palestinians from the illegal settlers. And again, as Fran has pointed out, Mike Huckabee, who's going to be the ambassador to Israel, doesn't recognise the West Bank as an entity. He calls it Judea and Samaria, which of course is what the right-wing settlers call it. So there's an article in the Observer today saying how much the right-wing in Israel welcome Trump's appointments, because they are absolutely, I mean, not just Huckabee, but the guy who was in the army and who thinks that the army has to be got rid of sissies, by which I think he means women, apart from anybody else. He and also became a presenter on Fox News. He's supposed to be the Defence Secretary in the United States. Marco Rubio, a China hawk, is going to be the Secretary of State. So these are fairly frightening appointments, but they're also appointments of which, when we look in Britain, we're seeing the same kind of thing, because it's very interesting how much, you know, Lammy and Starmer don't really like Trump. He's not their kind of person, and they don't really want to have to work with him. They'd much rather have been able to work with Harris, because as soon as he gets elected, you've got the little fireside chat with Joe Biden. You've got Lammy saying, oh, it's old news that I called him a fascist. Now, if you seriously thought somebody was a fascist, you might have reservations about going and meeting them and sitting in the White House with them or anything else. But obviously, yeah, fascist one day, perfectly reasonable President of the United States. The next day is Lammy's view. And of course, what it means is they will normalise the politics of Trump. They'll normalise it over wars and attacks on the Palestinians. They'll normalise it over Islamophobia. They will normalise it over the attacks on migrants. This is absolutely clear. And I think when you look at what it means for us, I suppose one of the things that's come out today is a sense of frustration that we haven't been able to do more to defend the Palestinians, and that we haven't been able to do more in general to stop this drive to war. And I think that two things are required here. Firstly, I think we need to understand what we have achieved, and I would say this movement has been an unprecedented movement. And it said earlier on in one of the sessions that you haven't seen anything like this since the suffragettes or the Chartists or any of the great historic movements. And I think this movement around Palestine will be seen in a very, very similar way in terms of eventually it will be seen as having succeeded. But even in the short term, we've shifted public opinion. We've forced the government to at least make lip service towards getting rid of some of the arms licences. We have got rid of Suella Braverman, we have done all of those things, and I think they're all very, very important. But at the same time, what more can we do? And I think when we talk about what more can we do, we can have more demonstrations. And I don't regard that as something which is just, we've done enough of those. We have to keep that pressure up. And it is the thing that people around the world know about. The truth is, what gets reported in Palestine, what gets reported in Washington, what gets reported in Downing Street is the size of those demonstrations and the regularity of those demonstrations. If anything, we need to make sure that each of those gets bigger and bigger in order to show that there are hundreds of thousands of people prepared to turn out week after week in order to show solidarity with the Palestinians. But also, when people say to you, well, what more can you do other than demonstrations? There are various forms of direct action, and people do those, and they're part of the movement, they're part of what we should do, but they themselves don't achieve the kind of overall success that we want, because they are actions by small numbers of people, and they don't have the mass impact that the demonstrations have. So they're a very important part, but they're only part of the movement. Where do you really want to look for change? Well, the trade union movement and the working class in this country, which has an instinctive support for the Palestinians, because like most people around the world, they can recognise the pressure when they see it. They can recognise one group of people who are attacking another group of people. They don't like what they see, and that means that we have to turn to the trade unions. Now, you know what it's like in this country if you're in a trade union. It's usually quite slow. It's usually difficult to get strikes. It's usually, if you do get a strike and support the Palestinians, it's almost certainly going to be illegal, because they've made so many things that people do in solidarity illegal. So none of those are easy things to do. But you can make steps towards those things, like we're trying to do with the next day of action on the 28th of November, which is now backed by the TUC, which is supported by unions like Unison and UCU, and which I think will be the biggest one that we've had so far. So I think it's really important we take this argument into the workplaces and into the wider working class, the people who might not always come on demonstrations, might never come on demonstrations, but who will support what the Palestinians are doing. So that's one thing I think we can do very, very importantly. I think we need to put more pressure on the politicians, and one of the ways you do that is through activity outside of Parliament. In fact, nearly all the way you put pressure on politicians is outside of Parliament, because they're very prone to not listening to what you say. And when you talk about that, I think we need to think about how we say to the MPs in local areas, what are you doing around Palestine? What are you doing about a ceasefire? What are you doing about an arms embargo and boycott and all the other things that we talk about? This isn't just something they can get elected once every 5 years and think people aren't ever going to challenge them about any of these things. And that brings me not just to them, but to the media as well, because the BBC wants to turn Palestine into a human interest story, which is only reported 3 or 4 items down the news, and we move on to much more important things like divisions in the cabinet or whatever it is. And we have to keep putting pressure on the media as well. We have our own alternative media, and it's very important, but we also have to have the pressure on the BBC, on the liberal media, the Guardian again, which is, all the time, doesn't want to report these things. We have to constantly be saying, what is it that you were saying about Palestine? We cannot allow them to do what they did with the Amsterdam story last week, which is to tell a total series of lies, to say that this was all an anti-Semitic attack, which you then find that actually the whole thing started with the Israeli flag, with the fans tearing down Palestinian flags, abusing Arabs and Palestinians in the street, attacking a taxi driver who was from North Africa. We have to be able to say, we're not going to let you have this narrative anymore. And one of the things the movement can do is to challenge these ideas. And that brings me to my final point. We live in an imperialist country. It's one of the oldest imperialist countries in the world. It has a Tory party completely connected to that whole agenda, but it also has a Labour Party connected to imperialism, which supports, we can see with Keir Starmer, the Union Jacks he has all the time, the way he talks about patriotism, the way he wants to increase military spending because it's the only thing that Britain has left as any kind of important leader on the world stage. That's what they're doing with all these things. We have to challenge those ideas, and that's why today has been such an important day in terms of people coming together to discuss all these things. It's just one day, but it's a day when I hope we can all go back and feel more confident about our arguments, about how we're going to defeat the imperialists, whether it's over Ukraine, whether it's over Palestine, whether it's over China, and we can begin to build a real mass movement around all these questions. So just finally to say, please do support Stop the War, please join Stop the War, please donate, but most importantly, please get active and let's start building a very, very big movement against the warmongers, Trump and Starmer and all the others. Thank you.